Welcome to the Funnel Reboot Podcast with your host, Glenn Schmeltzley. Let's get into today's show.
Hey, Glenn here. Welcome to Funnel Reboot, the show for analytically minded marketers. Let's get straight into today's show. There's more than one way to skin a cat. Being honest about it, doing something differently is often neither better or worse. It's just different. Take playing music. You can do it with an acoustic or an electric guitar. You can write with a pen and paper versus a computer. And continuing on that theme, the computer could be a Mac or a PC. You can program in many languages. Films can be made with many kinds of filming equipment, anything from an iPhone up to an IMAX Alexa 65mm. And this dynamic also applies to what we use as our analytics tool. And though Google Analytics gets a lot of attention, including on this podcast, to be fair, it's not the only game in town. The industry has a second tool, Adobe Analytics. And I wanted to talk with an expert. To my mind, today's guest is the person to find out about Adobe Analytics. She has 15 plus years of experience helping orgs solve their analytics problems, no matter where they are in their analytics maturity. And few can go as deep on pixel implementation, tag management, or data layers as she. As a consultant at boutique agency 33 Sticks, she works on all sides of implementation. And on the side, she's used her background as a developer to create some industry tools like the Adobe Analytics Beacon Parser and a mobile app called Pocket SDR. She loves helping others in the industry, and most days can be found in the Measure Slack or helping out on Twitter. Let's go to the Atlanta area to talk with Jenn Kunz. Jenn Kunz, welcome to Funnel Reboot.
Well, thank you. I'm very excited to be here.
Oh, thanks so much. So, Jenn, we're going to talk about a part of doing analysis that not everybody knows about. I will put myself in that group. The very first tool that I got my hands on was a log file parser. But beyond that, the first web tool that I had was Google Analytics. I know that you know Google Analytics, but there is another suite out there that you know quite well. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I work a lot with Adobe Analytics and have, it seems, my lot in life for about 16 years now. I started in 2006 at Omniture, which then got acquired by Adobe in, I think, 2009. Before that, Omniture was known as Superstats, but that would have been around like the urchin days of Google,
Right,
kind of.
right.
So, yeah, Adobe is tricky because it's hard to get exposure to, um, because there aren't sample logins. Like Google does a very
Right.
good job. There's a lot of different ways that you can get Google Analytics experience, but with Adobe, you have to work with an org that has it.
Yep.
And in order to work with an org that has it, you have to have experience with it. So they're doing things to make that a little bit easier these days to get some familiarity, but it is kind of an elusive tool for many, I think.
Sure. And so, let's just kind of talk about the economics of it for a moment. So, most people are aware Google Analytics is free. It is part of a larger suite that Google has, of course, which includes their ads product and other things that they can monetize. So, they're happy to give away the analytics piece. Adobe, so far as I can tell, doesn't have those. They can't make it a loss leader, right?
Right.
So Adobe Analytics is not cheap.
Yes, correct. It is a enterprise solution for sure. And I think if you look at the market share data out there that says, what percentage of websites have what on it, Google Analytics is pretty much everywhere. But because it's free, that may or may not mean much. Folks might not be using it at all. In fact, I have a lot of Adobe customers and clients that also have Google on their site just as a backup. Why not?
Mm-hmm.
So those numbers aren't entirely believable, but it is true that Adobe's not used nearly as widely by a long shot. But the higher up the Fortune 500 you go, the more likely you are to run into organizations that use Adobe fairly
Very,
exclusively. So,
very well put. And so there's a couple of things that we can talk to about um, positioning.
mhm.
So I'm not saying that one tool is stronger than another here, but
Mhm.
yes, Adobe can rightly say that their highest purpose is to give clients access to their analytics. The analytics, the whole analytics, and nothing but the analytics.
Yes. Well, I mean, they do have a suite of tools. They have an optimization tool and um, CDPs and all these other big enterprise things, but um, primarily, at least I work with the analytics piece. So.
Right. And there are some listening that do know the pieces of the Adobe suite that relate to building websites and
Hmm.
user experience. So
Yeah,
they certainly have a lot of justification in having a anchor product in the analytics space.
yeah. Although I will say, Adobe Experience Manager, it might as well be a different company than the rest of the Adobe suite.
Okay.
Like it just, I don't know, like any big organization, Adobe has acquired different tools over time, and
Yeah.
some have been welcomed into the fold a little bit better than others. um, I mean, certainly I'm not saying that Adobe doesn't properly support AEM, but um, their CMS. uh, but I've worked with Adobe Analytics for 16 years, and I have yet to be inside the AEM interface, even though I worked for Adobe for 4 years.
Wow.
So
Okay. All
they're
right.
very separate tools,
Yeah,
and they
clearly.
don't integrate particularly well.
Sure. Okay. Do you think, just peeling back for a quick moment, do
Mhm.
you think our industry as a whole is better when we do have some choice and there isn't a monopoly, meaning that, the only tool in town is Google? Do you think we're actually better from we get more features, we get a
So
little
yeah,
bit of good competition going?
yeah, absolutely. And we've seen it over time that they kind of play Google and Adobe play leapfrog a bit. Of one will get some new tool or some new capability, and the other takes it a little bit to catch up and then surpass. Um, I do think Google tends to push the innovation a little bit more
Okay.
uh, because and if I have Adobe friends listening to this, I'm still friends with a lot of product managers and stuff over there.
Right.
But it, that's kind of a blessing and a curse, because I think back to 2000, what, 13 or 14, when Google Analytics suddenly redefined what a session was.
Right.
They could do that. They were innovating. They were, seeing what works and what doesn't work. But if you're a major organization, I was with a company that has hundreds of different brands that they had to reteach, and all of that. That becomes very difficult. Whereas, Adobe is fairly solid and it's not going to make any big changes without warning you. And of course, a lot of the things that I learned in 2006 are still perfectly applicable, which
Right.
again, it could be seen as a good thing or a bad thing.
Right. Well, it's at least supporting the customer base.
Yes, yeah.
So, and as you said, you're climbing higher up the Fortune 500. So you are probably seeing industries where uh, it's difficult to, steer those ships in a
Yep,
different direction on a dime.
yep. I
Uh,
will say
yep.
Adobe has new offerings, customer journey analytics, which is
Hmm.
basically the Adobe Analytics workspace, which I love, but on top of whatever data set you want, and it gets much more kind of data sciencey, that they're pushing fairly heavily, and that's where a lot of their investment and focus is going. I don't think Adobe Analytics is going anywhere anytime soon, but um, for a long time I've joked that all the things I learned in 2006 are still true, and suddenly it's not. That they have this new tool that's very different in how it collects data and how it's set up and all of that. It in my mind, it's almost like Universal Analytics to GA4, or more specifically to BigQuery, because that's where a lot of
Mm,
GA4 stuff is happening. That
yes.
both of the tools feel like they are pushing everyone more into the big data direction, um, which, depending on the org, could be a good good or bad thing. But um, I don't want to make it sound like Adobe hasn't innovated or anything. Like it has a lot of big, new, different things. But analytics itself has stayed pretty solid for years.
Yeah, no, and if we look at the 2023 timeframe, so here we are in 2024, but for many of us, it is, the scars are still fresh
Yeah.
from Google making what are considered to be, lightning fast changes, even though
Hmm.
they did give, about a year or a year and a half, but they were still very quick changes and very large changes to a new
Yes.
data model and other things. And Adobe, as you say, may have some sensibilities around doing that Google doesn't. When it comes to what Adobe Analytics has, how comparable is it? Just starting on that, the data model and you know use of events
Hmm.
and even things like tagging. Help me understand, is it, are we talking like an animal in the sea and an animal on land? Is it that different, or are we
No,
kind of close?
I don't think so, especially if we're comparing to stuff like, I don't know, Amplitude or something. I don't think Google and Adobe are wildly different.
Okay.
Um, I did recently see somebody call Adobe uh, as having a event-based model, though I kind of question that.
Well, what do you
It
think?
is, I I'd say it's session-based. Perhaps the new tool, Customer Journey Analytics, that's definitely more event-based. But um, certainly you track a bunch of the user events. You track however much of, every action that the user takes on your site. But
Okay.
the ability to persist, find out conversions that happen 10 pages later and all of that, that there's definitely a lot of, you can do things on the event scope or the visit scope or the visitor scope,
Hmm.
um, and have a lot of control over attribution and what persists and applies to what.
So for people whose brains just melted there for a moment when they heard the word scope, uh,
Yes,
do us a favor. Just take us through
sure.
momentarily what you meant by that.
Yeah. Uh, when I, let's say that a user comes to my website from a paid search campaign, and they browse 5 or 6 pages, and then they add to cart, and perhaps they leave the site, come back the next day, and from there they make a purchase, and we want to be able to tie that purchase back to the, paid search campaign that they came in from. um, or it might be that I'm a UX person. I couldn't care less about the marketing, and I just want to know, well, what pages got them to check out? Where did they fall out of the checkout flow? So I can get it either way of just show me the scope, meaning the view that I'm getting is merely of a particular hit or a sequence of page views or something like that, or it could be I want a whole view of the visit, of where did they come from, or of the visitor. Know that yesterday they came from page search, and um, I'd have control over how long page search should have credit for whatever happens next. Um,
Yep.
but
That,
a,
that's a
a
pretty
lot,
good way of viewing it. Yep.
okay. Um, but things like, let's say, internal search term on your site to see what folks are looking for on your site. It might be that it's enough to know that 80 people searched for red basketball, but it might be that you want to know of the people who made a purchase, what was it they searched for, in which case it kind of broadens that view from to include that internal search term of basketball all the way through to when they made that purchase.
Yeah. Yeah. You're swiveling your perspective around.
Mhm.
So yeah, no, thank you for just taking us into that. And
Sure.
that is a good way to kind of do it. I'm great at asking dumb questions. What about how the tagging is done? So
Mhm.
on the Google side, we have Google Tag Manager. the first question I'll ask is Google Tag Manager even, something that can be
Mhm.
connected on a website that would have anything to do with Adobe Analytics, or does Adobe have its own piece to that?
Adobe does have its own tag manager. It's called, well, technically it's called Tags, but that's a recent rebranding that I think is silly. It had been called Launch,
Yep.
and I will still call it Launch. And it's a pretty powerful tag management solution. You can, however, deploy Adobe Analytics through GTM. I've seen folks do it.
Yep.
Yeah, and you can deploy Google Analytics through Launch. Um,
Right.
so it is technically free alongside any other, if you were an Adobe Analytics customer, then Adobe Launch is free. A lot of it functions very similarly to GTM of,
Okay.
here's the user action and maybe conditions on whether or not we want to track it, and here's
Yep.
the data we want to send. Yeah.
Nice. And it sounds like it has an interface that I, as a lowly non-tech, could use, or is a developer needed to set up some of these?
I'd say it's similar to GTM in that respect, that both
Okay.
companies can tout, when TMSs were fairly new in 2013 or 14, that you never have to talk to a developer. So easy a marketer can do it. Um, which
Yeah.
is insulting and also not true. Um,
Uh, it is, I even, there was a day where I didn't even know that TMS stood for Tag Management Solution. But yeah, sitting someone unrehearsed in front of one of
mhm.
those things, even if it does have all these drop downs,
Yeah.
and but if you still don't understand the construct it's using
Yes.
to get things through to your analytics package, you're no farther ahead. You will still need a
Yeah.
person who's
Absolutely.
technical. Yeah.
Yep. So similar to GTM in that regard. Uh, there are like 8 ways to accomplish any given thing in Adobe. It's very flexible, very powerful, but therefore kind of complicated and hard to know if you're doing things the right way necessarily. But lots of different ways work. So there you go. Um,
Okay, and is it fair to say that some of those ways are purely things that, I can use a drop down or a
mhm,
UI to
yeah,
do, and
yeah,
then
absolutely.
others it really does take a developer or someone who's
Yeah,
familiar with the mechanics, with the hooks inside of a field on a form or a
right.
video play button?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Or to work with your developers to set up some sort of data layer. So GTM and Google, they use very specifically called data layer
Right.
array to put all sorts of information into that GTM can use. Launch can use whatever you want. It can piggyback on what GTM uses. Though ideally you wouldn't ever have both on the same page just for performance and governance reasons.
Yeah.
Um, or it can use whatever you want. So uh, if you have, say, e-commerce on your site and you're implementing Google Analytics, it has very specific structure for how it's going to get information about the product SKU and color and all of that. Um, whereas Adobe Analytics, it can, or Launch, I suppose, can use any structure of that data, and then you'd have to map it into the appropriate variables within Launch. So,
Right.
yeah, that means that somebody has to decide on how are we going to structure the information that developers are providing us, um, which can be much more daunting and complicated than just following the single way that Google allows you to do e-commerce tracking.
Very well put. So if we argue the opposite side of that,
Mhm.
that difficulty in doing the setup of your tagging um, does have a payoff, meaning that you aren't restricted, you aren't
Mhm.
as restricted in what it is that you could later on see inside of analytics,
Yep,
because
exactly.
you got to determine up front. You used a Swiss Army knife and you were able to, use whichever aspect of it made sense for the task at hand.
Yep, absolutely. And I think, especially in the past, I always kind of thought of it as with Google, the implementation was in general designed to be very simple. You just throw the stuff on your page, and a lot of the uh, figuring out how to answer business questions with that data happens in the interface. So you cast a very wide net and then make sense of it afterwards. Whereas Adobe wants you to know exactly what it is that you are capturing and think it through first.
Yeah.
And then in the interface, it's all, very specific to your requirements and the business questions that you want to answer.
And I think some people who've been migrated to GA4 and are
Hmm.
looking at things like the explorations tab are all of a sudden nodding in agreement with you,
Hmm.
because they are realizing that it what I get to put on my screen is a function of what was laid out ahead of time. And
Yep.
if I just turned it on and I just use the plain vanilla setup, then I may not see what I want to see. And we're going to talk a little bit about actual interface. But before we do that, Jen, we're going to take a really quick break. Let me step away for a second to note our social media presence. On social, you'll see show-related updates about our guests. You'll see what's happening behind the scenes. Or you can simply talk to me. There are already 740 people who have connected with the show's social pages. And I've really loved how lately a few of you have posted positive comments about the show. It encourages me in making this podcast the best it can be. So find Funnel Reboot on LinkedIn or Instagram or X. Click follow and maybe say hi. Thanks a lot. Let's get back to the show. So Jen, we've got a piece of Adobe Analytics. If we opened it, what I've seen is we're immediately pushed into something called a workspace.
Hmm.
Workspaces have projects.
Hmm.
Help me here. What are workspaces? What are projects? Why is this different?
So Analysis Workspace is the, I don't know, tool set where reporting is done in the interface. They used to have their older set of reports, an older way of doing analysis, but that was sunset
Okay.
last month.
Okay.
So really, Workspace is the only place that Adobe has an interface for you to do that kind of analysis. Now you can export the data and various ways of looking at it in other formats, but if you're the primary interface for doing analysis is Workspace, and then a project is just a given, I don't want to say file, but essentially, yeah, it's the dashboard, it's the report,
Right.
it's the collection of visualizations that you've built for a particular purpose.
Let's go with that. Perfect. Do those have things that people who have been taken through dimensions and metrics in GA, are there like counterparts over
Mhm.
in Adobe Analytics once I get into the visualizations?
Yep, yep, and they're even called dimensions and metrics, though.
Oh, thank
Well,
goodness.
yeah, yes and
Ish.
no. in in the menus, you can look through the dimensions and the metrics. However, dimensions are made up of out of the box stuff like browser or geolocation or whatever it is, um, or custom variables. And uh, Adobe, this is where it gets kind of it gets teased for being complicated because you have props for traffic and evars and uh, yeah, it does get more complicated than merely here's a dimension.
Okay.
But and then metrics from an implementation or architecture standpoint are called events. In the interface, you'll see the word metrics, but unfortunately, Adobe chose to call it events, which back in 2002 probably didn't seem problematic. But now that event-driven data models and event has
Right.
come to mean many different things. Uh, so
Understood.
yes, but their metrics are usually based off of uh,
Okay.
events. So.
Okay. And is there, it sounds like it's scalable to not only websites, but if
Mhm.
there is a mobile app that
Yep.
I want
Yep.
to use the analytics on. So I have to appreciate that the meanings of individual things might be a little bit vague, but that's because they have to wrap around
Hmm.
such different things.
Yep. Yeah, and they do have mobile SDKs and mobile tracking. Then they also have the ability to receive like data imports through APIs and things like that.
Yep.
Um, so, but primarily it was designed with web in mind, I think is fair to say.
All right. Cool. When we're looking at other things that are going to be involved in the marketing mix, at least on the GA side. If I'm using Google Ads, then the setup of a conversion, it's fairly well. It's actually
Mhm.
tightly tied in back to my Google Ads, and then the ability for things like some of the campaign and some of the more detailed parameters about what drove that visit. That's flooding down into GA pretty much without any work.
Mhm.
Um, what do we have to be aware of if we're coming to an org that has Adobe Analytics and they're using Google Ads,
Mhm. Uh, which is pretty much everyone.
right?
Like, who doesn't have Google Ads? Um, you do lose some of that connection to, say, cost per click and
Uh-huh.
position and that sort of stuff that only Google's going to know. Adobe does have a advertising analytics kind of integration that you can pull some of that information in.
Yep.
Um, but campaign tracking is much more flexible, but it's very similar. So you can use UTM parameters just like Google uses, or you can use whatever, CID is a very common one,
Yep.
where there would just be one string of a series of, whatever identifier is going to make sense to you, and then you can upload information about that identifier to say, this was from this date, this platform, this whatever extra stuff you want.
Okay,
Um,
so this would be, I would, like in Google, I don't even have to
mhm,
think about the GCL ID, but
right.
there is a place for something like that, and if I can trigger
Yes.
it to show, then there's a place to put it.
Yeah, that you would put, well, it really is. It's a lot like UTM parameters that while the
Okay.
GCL ID will help you make connections, you may still have, information that you would put into UTM source medium,
Right.
content, all of those. Um,
Okay.
or if we're talking not Google Ads, but say email or something like that, then yeah, it's very similar. Of you just make sure that whoever's creating those links appends the query string parameters that'll help you identify that campaign.
Nice. Um, we're moving into an era of more privacy consciousness.
Mhm.
Companies that are dealing on both the um, North American side and on the European side of the Atlantic are, getting a little more uh, cognizant of
Mhm.
how we need to restrict things as far as audience tracking. Um, I know that Adobe Analytics, can do some things
Mhm.
with regards to segments. Um, is there anything that we need to know about so we can, do the things that we are still possible to do,
Right.
but make our experience for particular people visiting our properties,
Mhm.
reflect the fact that we have them in a certain segment bucket?
Mhm. Well, as far as privacy goes, there's kind of, well, it's going to be up to your DPO if you're in GDPR land, your data protection officer.
Hmm.
It's up to the lawyers, but in general, Um, if folks haven't opted in to tracking or they've opted out of it, then Adobe simply is not going to have any information on them. That's it.
Yep.
Is what it is. It doesn't have something like Google's consent mode where uh, it can still get some info that's just stripped
Hmm.
of any identifier. Technically, you can do that, but it's kind of a hack workaround that I think Adobe would rather we not do.
Yep.
Um,
No
But
means no.
yeah,
Yeah.
but then as far as within the tool, it has a lot of things that you can do to label different levels of sensitivity. You can obfuscate or just altogether get rid of IP addresses and um, other things that could be dodgy when it comes to um, privacy. It doesn't have something like Google Signals where it knows demographic information and stuff because it happens to be the browser as well, like in Google's case. Um, so from a privacy perspective, there's not much that you have to do there
Right.
to kind of respect things.
Fair enough, but why don't we return to that earlier
Mhm.
comment you made about Google innovates, and sometimes what giveth Google giveth, Google taketh away.
Mm-hmm.
And Signals is one of those ones that I've
Mm-hmm.
heard there might be a going away or a clawing
Yeah,
back.
I think
So
they've got
if
a big
Adobe's
privacy battle there.
right, so
Yeah.
yeah, subject to a court case, they may find that that's just it's too hot in the kitchen. They
Hmm.
want to get out. So if Adobe doesn't have something, let's not immediately jump on that as a negative.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah.
while we're on that, if we kind of peel back in general, you're an analyst. You've had a chance to look over on both sides, but you've clearly spent time on the Adobe side. What are some general likes and dislikes that you have between the two?
I love Adobe's flexibility. Its segmenting abilities is, in my opinion, far superior to anything GA4 has, or even what GA3 had, or Analytics
Hmm.
had. Um, that really you can build whatever segment you can dream up, and build as many of them as you'd like. Same with calculated metrics, though that's probably a little bit more comparable to GA. It doesn't have much by way of built-in reporting. So especially when compared to Universal Analytics, if you were an e-commerce site, there were a lot of really great reports that already existed and
Yeah.
helped answer your questions. Adobe does have some templates and things like that, but usually you're going to be building your reports from scratch. But it makes it, in my opinion, fairly easy to do so with a few nuances that um, you might have some questions that have to be answered initially about how to interpret the data, but I think it's a fairly easy interface to use and pretty powerful. Um, Trying to think of what I prefer about GA4 is much harder to. Universal
Sure.
Analytics had definite advantages. GA4, BigQuery is
Okay.
great.
Well, actually, I was going to ask about that. So, is there a data warehouse equivalent over on the Adobe side, or is it easy to get your data out of it into the cloud data warehouse of your choice?
There is a kind of data warehouse solution, Adobe Experience Platform, and I was talking about customer journey
Hmm.
analytics, where you can kind of
Hmm.
do analysis on whatever data set you want. You can bring it in and have it stored, or you can have that set up on connections of pulling data from Google Cloud Platform or
Okay.
Amazon Snowflake, you name it, can be brought into AEP, and then you would use that. Sorry, AEP being Adobe Experience Platform,
Yeah.
which is a very confusing brand thing because it could be referring to their data platform, but they've just kind of call everything now Adobe Experience Platform.
Ooh.
Branding wise is a little tricky. Um,
Yes.
and then you would use customer journey analytics on top of that to do analysis on that data. And likewise, you can always export your Adobe data into something like Snowflake or BigQuery, which I've seen folks doing recently. Um, and you just a few things about the how to process it you'd have to sort through, but it's very doable.
Nice. Want to get perhaps a bit personal here for a second because you had been telling us about your background in how you got so far back associated with Adobe Analytics. And if I'm right, you do have like some technical
Mhm.
abilities in your background.
Yep.
So, like, tell us, you know, not only how you came to, appreciate such a technical and sophisticated tool, but maybe, as you look back on your career, what would you say to other people who are asking themselves if they should, try to be amphibious, in my
Hmm.
words, to hop over from one side to the other, and what might that do to help their career?
Hmm. I do have a technical background. I was once a web developer. Has actually majored in linguistics, and my university figured out that linguistics isn't particularly useful as an undergrad, but that people who are into grammar and syntax and editing often are good at programming. So I took some very dumbed down computer science for liberal arts majors classes
Right.
and learned HTML and JavaScript and CSS. Um, and became a web developer. But fairly soon after graduating college, I was at a web development shop that, like a slave factory. It was horrible. I really disliked my job and ran into an old friend and said as much, that I'm miserable at my current place. And he said, "Oh, you should apply at Omniture, where I work." Um, that was Ben Gaines, who's now like senior VP of product at Adobe. um,
Mm.
so I knew the right person and started all the way back in 2006. Left the industry for a couple years when I had kids, and then came back.
Hmm.
And I've been at various consulting agencies since, including one more stint back at Adobe. Uh, Adobe, absolutely, it is a valuable, though very niche skill to have. That,
Yeah.
right now I can name four different companies that have reached out to me and said, "We're looking for an analyst. Can you help us find someone with Adobe experience?"
Mm.
Because it's so hard to get if you don't already work for somebody who has Adobe.
Yeah.
Um, so I would recommend, if you have the opportunity, absolutely get to know as much as you can about it. There is a fantastic community around it, which I think you see with Google as well, like,
Yep.
SEMO, Ahava, and all of that. There are kind of the equivalents of that on the Adobe side. And the Adobe product folks are very eager to be helpful. I won't say that their client care support is the best in the world, but whose is? Um,
Yeah.
but the product teams and the educators and evangelists are all super helpful. So,
Yeah. And I think there's one thing that you can absolutely say, which is they've been in the game for so long, they're
mhm.
not going anywhere.
Yes.
They're going to continue to be a strong force. And as you described that leapfrogging earlier, there are areas where if Google is dropping the ball, Adobe will
Mhm,
certainly seize on that and develop further. And it may be good to know that, if only for, even if you don't move over to that side of the street, to see that this is where the industry might be going.
mhm. Yep, absolutely. Especially as Adobe is moving to this new data collection model. So right now, um, if we forget tag management and we just strictly talk
Okay.
about like what I would be doing to send data to Adobe, it uses very similar technology to what, well, everyone else does. By, it creates a tiny invisible pixel um, on your site, where the query string parameters of the URL of that pixel have all of the information that it needs.
Hmm.
So that's what pretty much any marketing pixel does these days. Um, but to build that pixel, you'd have to tell it that you want evar5, which you've set aside as your internal search word dimension. s.evar5 equals whatever the red basketball, and send that along. And you would have to know what evar5 is, and
Hmm.
you'd have turned that on in the interface and given it a friendly name and everything. And that's all been the same since 2004, probably, even before that. Um, but now they're changing it up for the first time since I began this whole
Yeah.
thing. That they have a different data model that's all key value pairs. They call it XDM, Experience Data Model, where I would just send in the item dot name equals basketball, or whatever key
Right.
value pair I want. And then if I'm in customer journey analytics, I would just pull up a report for that key of item name. And there would be no mapping to EVARs or anything like that. But right now, if I'm still in analytics and I'm trying that new data collection, then there is like a series of mappings that take place to line that all up. So it's it is changing. It is becoming more logical, truly, of just, you decide on the thing you want to call, how you want to call this dimension, and that's what it is in your data model. Um,
Yeah.
but that opens it up uh, to make it much more complicated, and you need people who know how to make data models to start going down those routes. So,
Without a doubt, and I can't help but use, a little bit of that linguistics uh, sensibility there. You just spoke a little bit of a different language there.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. We're back. But it is impressing upon me how there does need to be a decent familiarity with the other system if you're going to use it. So, as you say, the best thing is to, if your career is taking you in that direction, um, why not try it? Jump
Mhm.
in. There's the community, as you mentioned. There's people like you who are always willing to share knowledge about this. And if you are willing to do that little bit of translating between what you knew and what you don't yet know,
Mhm.
you'll be able to get there.
Yep. And that's one of my favorite things about our industry is, well, these days it might not be true, but for the longest time, nobody had gone to college or as a
Hmm.
child said, I want to be a digital web analyst.
No.
We all are here because there was a gap somewhere and we saw it and we decided to learn and dive in and fill those gaps and learn and adapt. So our industry is full of people who are from all sorts of different backgrounds,
Right.
who have had to learn this as they go. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. So the I don't know thing should not paralyze you. It should just be I don't know this yet. And I'm speaking with someone who also had a point in time where they didn't know this.
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
And uh, I spend a lot of time on Measure Slack, the kind of
Right.
industry Slack channel,
Yep.
and the Adobe Analytics, both the launch, if you're on the implementation side, or the analysis side, both have very strong communities that will happily answer questions and help folks out.
Sweet. Sweet. We'll have links in the show notes to all that. Jen, is there anywhere
Mhm.
else that you would point people to if they want to get a hold of you?
Yeah, so Measure Slack, certainly. There's another online community called the Test and Learn community that's a little
Mm.
bit more optimization focused, but that's also on Slack and YouTube and stuff. I'm still on Twitter. I'm not going to call it the other thing. Um, also on Blue Sky, just look up my
Yep.
name. I have a website and a blog. It's digitaldatatactics.com. It's probably not going to have a lot of content that's particularly interesting to non-Adobe folks at the moment. No, there's some Google stuff on there occasionally. Um, and LinkedIn, I suppose.
And LinkedIn. Oh
Yeah.
my goodness. Yeah, you're all over the
Though I'll
place, which is
admit, I'm
wonderful.
really bad at keeping up on LinkedIn. Like you can only monitor so many things.
Yeah, that's right. And also do your job.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but you do it very well. Jen, I want to
Well,
thank
thank
you
you.
for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's been a
Yeah.
pleasure.
And it has certainly given us insight.
Thanks for listening. Follow the show on Twitter at Funnel Reboot. If you like what you have heard today, please consider leaving a review wherever you get your podcasts.